Move back. Let me see your ID.
Officer, what's wrong?
I gave you an order. Do what I said.
I'll comply with the lawful detention. What crime are you investigating?
You're being non-compliant right now.
Lawful instructions require lawful grounds.
Have something illegal here?
This patrol officer thought he was just teaching a lesson to a suspicious driver. He ignored federal credentials, refused to verify them, and kept escalating a routine stop into a hostile detention. Then the officer's whole posture changed, because the first set of federal SUVs started turning onto the frontage road, and the radio traffic stopped sounding local. He was about to learn he had just handcuffed an undercover DEA agent. Real quick, where are you watching from? What country or what state? Drop it in the comments. And if you like stories where arrogance meets cameras, paperwork, and real accountability, hit like and subscribe. Now back to what happened. By the time anyone driving past could tell something was wrong, the stop had already turned into a control scene. The officer, Cameron Voss, had the driver out of the car and positioned where Voss wanted him. Voss stood close, kept his voice hard, and kept giving rapid instructions designed to keep the driver reacting instead of thinking. The driver, Devin Cole, didn't match the picture Voss was trying to paint. Cole stayed composed. His hands stayed visible. His movements stayed slow. He didn't argue in circles. He repeated one request and one request only. Verify his federal credentials through the proper channel and stop treating the stop like an interrogation. Voss didn't take the easy exit. He treated the credentials like a prop. He dismissed the ID as something anyone could buy. He ignored the fact that there was a standard way to confirm federal status, and he ignored it on purpose. You could see it in the way he kept the situation moving forward instead of pausing to check. He wasn't trying to confirm the truth. He was trying to force a confession to something he hadn't proven. Cole had been working undercover for the DEA as part of a federal task force. That meant his car wasn't a marked unit. His clothes weren't tactical. His day didn't look like law enforcement to strangers. That's the whole point of undercover work. It's also why verification exists, because local traffic enforcement will occasionally bump into federal work, and the system is supposed to prevent exactly this kind of collision. Voss treated that reality like it was a challenge to his authority. The stop started in the most predictable way possible. Commercial strip, warehouses and gas stations, early evening with steady traffic. So there were plenty of witnesses, even if nobody intended to be one. Voss claimed a minor reason to pull Cole over, the kind of vague justification that shows up in thousands of body cams. Slight lane drift, equipment issue, vehicle matches a general description. Nothing that should have turned into cuffs. Cole pulled over cleanly and immediately. No delay, no sudden moves. When Voss walked up, he didn't approach like a neutral professional assessing risk. He approached like someone who had already decided the driver was a problem. Cole did what trained agents do during unexpected contact. He stayed calm and controlled the tempo. He didn't rummage around. He didn't escalate with attitude. He gave standard identification. Then he provided federal credentials in a way that kept everyone safe and kept the interaction clear. That should have triggered a simple sequence. Voss should have stepped back, called it in, asked dispatch to verify, and if he didn't know the right method, he should have called a supervisor. It would have taken minutes. Voss did the opposite. He started stacking commands. He pushed Cole out of the vehicle and started asking questions that weren't traffic-related. He tried to get Cole talking about where he was going, who he was meeting, why he was in that area, and what he had in the car. He kept circling back to the same suspicion, even though he hadn't developed probable cause for anything beyond the stop. Cole didn't get pulled into it. He stayed focused on verification and boundaries. He kept insisting Voss either confirm the credentials properly or call a supervisor who would. That refusal to play along annoyed Voss. You could hear it in his tone and see it in his posture. The questions became sharper. The space between them tightened. The officer's officer safety language started showing up, not as a real response to a threat, but as a justification for control. Then Voss made the decision that turned a bad stop into a major problem. He handcuffed Cole. He didn't do it because Cole attacked him. He didn't do it because Cole tried to run. He did it because Cole wouldn't submit to an improvised interrogation, and Voss didn't like being told, verify it. The cuffs changed everything. It created a detention that had to be justified later, and it created a paper trail that would include bodycam footage, dispatch logs, and supervisor involvement. Cole stayed controlled even then, because he had two problems at the same time. He had to keep himself safe and protect his identity, but he also had to avoid blowing an active operation. Undercover work has real timing. It has real people in motion. When you miss a check-in window, it doesn't stay private for long. That's what Voss didn't understand. He thought he was dealing with a driver who would eventually fold. Cole's task force had a schedule. Cole missed it. Someone noticed. While Voss kept pressing and refusing to verify, the other side of the system started waking up. People called, people checked. People asked where Cole was and why he wasn't answering. The longer Voss dragged it out, the more attention the stop attracted from people with authority he couldn't wave off. The moment the shift began, it didn't start with sirens. It started with Voss's radio. The radio traffic changed tone because a supervisor got involved. Not the casual kind of, what's going on over there, but the clipped, urgent kind, where someone has already heard enough to be concerned. The supervisor told Voss to stop escalating, hold position, and wait for verification. Voss didn't comply the way he should have. He pushed back on the radio, still acting like he had the bigger picture, still acting like the credentials were a lie, still acting like the detention was his call alone. And right after that, headlights swept across the scene from the side road, followed by the unmistakable shape of federal SUVs pulling in with purpose. Federal vehicles started arriving within minutes of the supervisor radio traffic, and the difference was obvious even to people who didn't know law enforcement. These weren't random patrol units responding to a suspicious person call. They were coordinated task force vehicles, and the people getting out of them moved with purpose and clear roles. Officer Derek Halverson saw the first one pull in behind his cruiser and tightened up. He kept Jamal Mercer in handcuffs near the shoulder, angled away from the car, the way officers do when they want full control of someone's movement and sightline. Halverson kept talking as if the scene was still his, as if the arrival of new units didn't change the rules. Mercer didn't react. He didn't try to talk over anyone. He stayed still, kept his breathing controlled, and kept his hands where they were supposed to be. He'd already done the key thing. He'd identified himself as federal and asked Halverson to verify it the correct way. The fact that this had gone on long enough for backup to arrive told Mercer exactly what kind of officer he was dealing with. Two people stepped out of the first federal SUV. They weren't dressed like patrol. They weren't aggressive. They were plainclothes with clear identifiers, and they immediately started doing what Halverson should have done from the start: establish facts, establish verification, and control the risk without turning it into a personal dominance contest. One of them approached Halverson and asked for the detention bases and what verification steps had been taken. Not a debate, basic accountability questions. Halverson answered with the usual shield language. He described Mercer as suspicious, said Mercer was evasive, and implied the credentials were questionable. He leaned on officer safety while avoiding the one point that mattered. He still hadn't verified the credentials through dispatch, a supervisor, or any recognized federal contact channel. The federal agent pressed him on specifics. What information did Halverson call in? Did dispatch confirm anything? Did he request a supervisor before using cuffs? Did he document any articulable threat that justified a custodial detention during a traffic stop? Halverson didn't have clean answers. He tried to redirect the conversation towards feelings and assumptions. He kept describing what he believed Mercer might be. That's where officers get themselves in trouble, because feelings don't hold up against recordings. At the same time, the people arriving didn't swarm Halverson or treat him like an enemy. They treated him like a local officer who had created a preventable problem and needed to be managed before he made it worse. More federal vehicles arrived. A couple unmarked SUVs. A marked unit tied to the task force. The perimeter tightened, not in a theatrical way, but in a practical way. Traffic control, witness management, safety spacing, and a clear line of authority forming around the situation. Halverson started realizing his story wasn't landing the way it usually did. With regular callers and regular stops, he could talk fast, sound confident, and rely on the assumption that the detained person must have done something. Here, the arriving agents weren't buying tone. They wanted process and proof. Halverson tried to regain control by increasing pressure on Mercer. He repeated commands toward him, warned him about making it worse, and acted like Mercer's calm was a problem. Mercer didn't give him the reaction he wanted. Mercer stayed steady and kept repeating the same boundary. Federal agent, credentials presented, verify through proper channels. Then Halverson's own department radio traffic started cutting through again, louder and more direct. His supervisor's voice wasn't casual anymore. The supervisor told Halverson to stop escalating, maintain distance, and wait for verification. The supervisor also asked a direct question about whether Halverson had placed Mercer in cuffs and why. Halverson answered on the radio in a way that sounded defensive, and that's important because radio logs become evidence too. If you contradict yourself, you don't only contradict yourself on camera, you contradict yourself in the official record. A federal supervisor arrived next, and the structure of the scene changed immediately. She identified herself clearly, then addressed Halverson like someone who had already reviewed enough information to know this was out of bounds. She asked why a claimed federal agent was handcuffed without verification and why Halverson had ignored the supervisor instruction to hold and confirm. Halverson tried to justify it again with suspicion language. He said the ID looked wrong. He said Mercer wasn't cooperating the way he wanted. He said Mercer's behavior made him uneasy. The federal supervisor didn't argue, and she asked for the verification attempt. She asked for the dispatch confirmation. She asked for the documented reason a traffic stop turned into a custodial detention. She asked if Halverson searched the vehicle or attempted to. Halverson had almost nothing to produce. The whole situation existed because he chose not to verify early and chose force instead. The federal supervisor then turned to Mercer and asked him basic welfare and integrity questions. Was he okay? Had any property been handled? Had the vehicle been accessed? Had he been forced to reveal anything compromising? Mercer answered in the controlled, limited way an undercover agent has to answer. He confirmed he presented credentials, requested verification, and warned that detention was interfering with active federal work. He did not discuss targets or operation details. At that point, the federal supervisor gave a direct instruction to remove the handcuffs. One of the agents stepped in and removed them carefully. No drama, no speeches, just correction and control returning to the proper place. Mercer rolled his wrists once, not to show off, but because cuffs hurt when they've been on longer than they should have been. Halverson stood there watching it happen, and now you could see the shift in him. He wasn't confident anymore. He wasn't performing anymore. He was calculating. He was trying to figure out how to explain a decision that was recorded from multiple angles, contradicted by his own radio traffic, and now confirmed as wrong by people who had the authority to say it on the spot. He tried to backpedal. He claimed he didn't know. He claimed he couldn't verify. He claimed he had to act fast. None of that fixed the central issue. He refused the verification pathway when it was offered, then he escalated anyway. As soon as the cuffs came off, the scene stopped being a debate and started being documentation. The federal supervisor didn't waste time arguing with Derek Halverson. She treated him like a risk factor that needed to be contained. She told her people to secure Mercer's vehicle area without touching anything that could compromise the operation. She told another agent to start a timeline while everything was still fresh. That included the stop time, the moment credentials were presented, the moment Halverson refused verification, the moment he escalated to cuffs, and the moment his own supervisor ordered him to pause. Halverson tried to keep talking. He kept trying to shape the narrative in real time. He kept repeating the same justifications in different words, hoping one version would stick. It wasn't working. His own supervisor arrived from the local side, and the supervisor didn't come in to back him automatically. The supervisor came in to manage damage. That's what a smart supervisor does when they hear a stop has turned into a potential civil rights issue with federal involvement. The supervisor asked Halverson for his Bodycam status first, not his opinion. Status. Was it recording the entire time? Was it activated before contact? Did he pause it? Did he move it? Simple questions that tell you whether someone knew they were wrong. Halverson answered, and the supervisor immediately told dispatch to preserve the audio and logs. That meant the initial call reason, the unit arrival times, Halverson's radio responses, and the moment he was told to stand down. Those recordings don't care about anyone's pride. They're just there, and they don't forget. Mercer stayed close to the federal group, but kept his focus on the operation problem, not the ego problem. A detention like this can blow an undercover timeline in seconds. If he missed a meet or a surveillance handoff, targets could move. If local units started running his name through systems or broadcasting his status incorrectly, it could leak into channels that were never supposed to have it. The federal supervisor handled that part cleanly. She asked for only the information needed to keep Mercer safe and keep the case intact. She didn't ask him to explain the whole investigation on the roadside. She didn't pressure him to say anything that would end up on local body cam footage. That contrast mattered. Halverson had tried to force Mercer into talking. The DEA team moved like they understood rules, risk, and containment. Halverson kept hovering near the conversation like he deserved a seat at the table. He didn't. He had already shown he couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. Now the accountability part started showing itself in small, concrete actions. The supervisor told Halverson to step back and wait by his cruiser. That instruction wasn't punishment. It was control. It also created a clean separation on camera. Federal personnel handling their agent, local leadership handling their officer. Halverson didn't like it. He tried to argue the instruction. He tried to suggest the federal people were overreacting. That was another mistake. Every extra word gave the recordings more material. Then came the moment where the bias stopped being implied and started being obvious, even without slurs. Halverson tried to justify the stop by describing Mercer in terms that didn't match the objective facts. He leaned into stereotypes about criminal behavior, kept talking about the kind of person he thought he had, and framed Mercer's calm, credentialed response as manipulative. It was the kind of reasoning you hear when an officer isn't reacting to behavior, but to an assumption about who the person is. The federal supervisor didn't let that pass. She didn't need to quote policy like a robot. She cut to the core. Halverson had been offered a verification pathway early, and he refused it. He escalated anyway. He kept escalating after his own supervisor told him to stop. That isn't policing. That's ego overriding procedure. Mercer's team started collecting identifiers quietly. Badge number, unit assignment, names of responding officers, witness locations, body cam confirmation for everyone on scene. That's how these incidents become cases, not by yelling, by preserving evidence and narrowing facts until excuses have nowhere to hide. Halverson's supervisor called for another unit to take over Halverson's patrol responsibilities for the rest of the shift. That's an immediate signal. It means leadership already expects this to go beyond a simple coaching conversation. It also means they want Halverson off the street before he makes a second bad decision. Halverson tried to negotiate his way out of that too. He suggested it was unnecessary. He acted like he was being treated unfairly, and nobody cared. Not anymore. The federal supervisor told Halverson's supervisor that this wasn't staying local. She made it clear the detention interfered with a DOJ-linked operation and involved a credentialed federal agent being restrained without verification. That's the kind of fact pattern that triggers federal interest fast, especially when there's Bodycam. Mercer didn't celebrate. He didn't taunt. He didn't need to. His win wasn't emotional, it was structural. The truth was recorded and the right people were now in the loop. Before Mercer left the scene, the federal supervisor did one more thing that mattered. She ensured Mercer's vehicle wasn't searched by local officers. If Halverson had touched anything, it would become a chain of custody issue. It would create exposure risk for the case. It would also create another legal problem for the department. Halverson's supervisor asked Halverson a direct question about whether he attempted a search or opened any doors. Halverson gave an answer that didn't sound confident, and that hesitation landed badly. When someone is sure they followed policy, they don't hesitate on basic facts. Mercer was moved away from the shoulder and into the federal vehicle area briefly so his team could do a quick welfare check and get him back on track. His phone and communication plan got adjusted. His task force would reroute the operation if needed. They weren't going to gamble the case because one patrol officer wanted to feel powerful during a traffic stop. Halverson watched Mercer leave the immediate detention space and realized the scene had ended without him being the hero of his own story. He wasn't the authority figure anymore. He was the problem that had to be managed. And right there, still on the roadside, the supervisor told Halverson he was being pulled from duty pending review. Not a future promise, a now action. He was instructed to keep his body cam on, remain available, and prepare a written statement. That's the beginning of consequences. The local department opened a formal internal affairs case and immediately locked down evidence. They pulled the primary officer's body cam, any secondary officer cams, dash video if it existed, dispatch audio, and supervisor radio traffic. They also pulled the officer's stop history for patterns, how often his routine stops turned into detentions, how often he used cuffs without an arrest, how often supervisors had to correct him. The officer got taken off the street while the review ran. Administrative leave is standard because it prevents a second incident and it keeps the investigation clean. Then they ordered a written statement, not a casual explanation, a documented account that gets compared to video, second by second. Internal affairs focused on a short list of questions. Did the driver present federal credentials? Did the officer take any real steps to verify them? Was there an actual safety threat that justified handcuffs? Did the officer follow supervisor direction once told to stop and wait? Did the officer try to search the vehicle or pressure for information outside the scope of a traffic stop? If the answers don't line up with the footage, the case becomes simple. The officer's intent stops mattering. His actions become the issue. On the federal side, the response stayed blunt and procedural. They treated it as interference risk. They requested the same evidence package, documented the operational disruption in general terms, and elevated it through the proper channels. When a local officer refuses to verify and escalates anyway, it's not just bad judgment. It's a trust failure between agencies, and federal leadership takes that personally because it puts people and cases at risk. Then the fallout split into 3 lanes. Lane 1, discipline. The department moved towards suspension or termination based on policy violations that are easy to prove on recordings. Failure to verify, improper escalation, and ignoring supervision. Union process can slow it down, but it can't rewrite video. Lane 2, civil rights exposure. The agent's side pursued accountability through legal channels. The core argument wasn't complicated. Credentials were presented, verification was available, and the officer escalated anyway. If bias indicators show up in tone, assumptions, or inconsistent justification, it strengthens the case that this wasn't a neutral mistake. Lane 3, command level changes. The department had to show it learned something, because this kind of incident makes everyone look incompetent. So they tightened procedures, where ego usually hides. Mandatory credential verification steps before escalation required supervisor involvement. when a stop extends past a set time or turns into cuffs. Automatic review when cuffs are used without an arrest. Clear discipline triggers for refusing verification and for defying supervisor orders. Clearer interagency contact pathways so local supervisors can confirm federal status quickly. Federal task forces also adjusted their side. Better check-in rules, faster missing contact triggers, and clearer emergency verification, so a single patrol officer can't trap an undercover agent in a roadside mess again. In the end, the officer didn't get to frame it as a misunderstanding. He created a record. Cameras, radio logs, and supervisor instructions pinned it down. That record followed him into internal affairs, into legal review, and into whatever discipline came next. And the agent didn't win by outshouting anyone. He won because he stayed controlled, stuck to verification, and let the system document the failure. That's the whole point of accountability stories like this. Power works until there's proof. Proof changes everything. If you've ever been in a situation where someone in authority ignored facts and kept escalating anyway, say it in the comments. Where did it happen and how did it end? And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and focused on consequences, subscribe.
Run the plate and VIN.
I'm already on it. Just hang right here for me. Plate and VIN don't match. That's a problem. Dr. Mercer, I need you to step away from the car. Turn around. Hands behind your back.
This officer thought he had found an easy target. A black man in a luxury car, late evening, quiet street, badge on one side, one driver on the other. In his head, the story was already written. The car probably was not his. The documents probably would not hold up. A little pressure would expose something. What he did not realize was that he was about to create a clear record of profiling, overreach, and bad judgment, all of it captured step by step. Tell me where you are watching from, and if you like stories where abuse of authority gets exposed by facts, like the video, and subscribe. The stop happened in the medical district just after dark. Dr. Adrian Mercer was driving home after a long day at work. He had spent the day moving between surgery and hospital business. He owned the luxury car. It was legally registered. It was insured. He was not doing anything unusual. He was heading home. Officer Daniel Kessler noticed the car first. Then he noticed the driver. That was when the stop really began in his mind. He waited for a traffic reason and used a minor lane change issue to pull the car over. Dr. Adrian Mercer did exactly what a driver is supposed to do. He pulled over safely. He stayed inside. He waited for instructions. When Officer Kessler walked up to the window, he asked for license, registration, and insurance. Dr. Adrian Mercer handed them over right away. Everything matched. The name on the license matched the registration. The insurance was active. The plate matched the vehicle. That should have ended the ownership question. It did not. Officer Kessler looked over the documents and started asking questions that had nothing to do with a normal traffic stop. He wanted to know whether the car really belonged to Dr. Adrian Mercer. He asked how long he had owned it. He asked where he got it. He asked whether it was leased, financed, or borrowed. He asked where Dr. Adrian Mercer was coming from and what he did for work. The answers were calm and direct. The car was his, the paperwork was valid. There was no confusion in the documents and no sign of theft. But Officer Kessler did not treat the paperwork as proof. He treated it like something that needed to be challenged until it matched his assumption. That is what changed the stop. A normal officer checks documents to confirm facts. Kessler was doing the opposite. He had already decided the facts were wrong, and now he was looking for a way to force the stop in that direction. Dr. Adrian Mercer understood very quickly that this was not really about the lane change. He did not argue. He did not try to impress the officer. He did not start talking about status or money. He answered what he needed to answer and stayed controlled. Officer Kessler took the documents back to his patrol car and ran the checks. The vehicle did not come back stolen. The registration was current. The insurance was active. There was still no factual basis for a theft theory. He kept going anyway. Over the radio, he started describing the stop in a way that made it sound more serious than it was. He suggested there were concerns about ownership. He framed Dr. Adrian Mercer as suspicious without pointing to any real conduct that supported that label. He was not reporting a clear problem. He was setting up a version of events that might justify pushing the stop further. That mattered later because the cameras were telling a different story. The dash camera showed a routine stop. The body camera showed a driver who stayed calm, followed instructions, and gave valid documents. The radio traffic showed Officer Kessler trying to build suspicion before he had evidence for it. He returned to the car and started asking the same questions again, in slightly different ways. He was trying to catch Dr. Adrian Mercer in some inconsistency. There was none. The answers stayed the same because the facts stayed the same. At that point, the stop had already gone past what it should have been. Officer Kessler was not checking a traffic issue anymore. He was trying to make Dr. Adrian Mercer explain why he was allowed to own his own car. That was the real stop, not the lane change, not safety, not a paperwork issue. Just one officer refusing to accept what was already in front of him. Dr. Adrian Mercer did not help him stretch it into more than that. He stayed measured. He answered clearly. He did not give the officer anything that could honestly be called threatening, evasive, or disorderly. That only made Officer Kessler more determined. He went back to broad language. He talked about needing more verification. He acted like the stop still had unresolved issues, even though the basic checks had already come back clean. He kept the pressure on because he did not want to admit that the premise of the stop had failed. Then he took the next step and asked Dr. Adrian Mercer to get out of the car. Dr. Adrian Mercer complied. Outside the vehicle, he asked what the actual issue was. It was a fair question. The documents were valid. The car had not been flagged as stolen. There was no obvious reason for the stop to keep expanding. Officer Kessler did not give a clear answer. He stayed vague. He talked in general terms about ownership concerns and verification. That vagueness was important. It showed he still had no concrete basis for what he was doing. He circled the car, stalled for time, and kept trying to turn doubt into evidence. But doubt is not evidence. Disbelief is not probable cause. And a luxury car does not become suspicious just because an officer thinks the wrong person is driving it. Dr. Adrian Mercer could see what was happening. The officer was building the whole stop around a theory he could not prove. He was using the time, the uniform, and the pressure of the roadside to make that theory feel official. That is how bad stops grow, not from facts, not. From confidence backed by authority, and Officer Kessler still thought he was in control. He thought he had found someone he could push around. He thought the stop would end with the driver rattled and the officer satisfied that he had asserted control. He did not know he was standing there with cameras recording every unsupported decision. He did not know dispatch records would preserve the way he framed the stop. And he had no idea who Dr. Adrian Mercer really was in that city. At that point, to him, this was still just a driver he did not believe. That mistake was about to cost him. Officer Daniel Kessler had already stretched the stop far beyond the traffic reason he used to initiate it. By then, he was no longer checking anything in a normal way. He was trying to save the assumption that had driven the stop from the beginning. He had seen a black man in a rare car, decided that ownership did not make sense, and now he was too deep into that idea to step back cleanly. Dr. Adrian Mercer was standing outside the car, calm, cooperative, and clearly asking for a real explanation. Officer Kessler still did not have one. He had valid identification. He had valid registration. He had active insurance. The vehicle had not come back stolen. There was no actual conflict in the paperwork. So instead of pointing to facts, he kept relying on general language about verification and concern. That was the point where the stop became dangerous in a legal sense. The problem was no longer disrespect. The problem was that Kessler was holding a man on the roadside without a solid basis and trying to make that detention sound more justified than it was. He had already used the radio to frame Dr. Adrian Mercer as suspicious. Now he needed the stop to produce something that would support that framing. He started pressing harder. He asked the same ownership questions again, but now the tone was different. It sounded less like inquiry and more like accusation. He wanted details about when the car had been purchased, how it had been paid for, and why Dr. Adrian Mercer was driving through that area at that hour. None of those questions solved the real problem because there was no real problem to solve. They were pressure questions. The goal was to force hesitation, not to clarify facts. Dr. Adrian Mercer stayed measured. He did not try to debate the officer. He did not start talking too much. He gave direct responses and kept returning to the same basic point. The vehicle belonged to him. The documents were valid, and there was no lawful reason to keep treating the car like stolen property when the records were not showing that. That answer should have forced Officer Kessler to either end the stop or admit he had nothing. He did neither. Instead, he kept expanding the suspicion. He started suggesting that even if the car had not been flagged, that did not fully settle the issue. He hinted that the paperwork could still be fraudulent. He hinted that Dr. Adrian Mercer's behavior was unusual. Those claims mattered because they later became part of the official justification. They also mattered because the footage did not support them. Dr. Adrian Mercer was not acting erratic. He was not changing his answers. He was not trying to leave. He was not interfering. The video showed a man standing still, listening, responding, and asking clear questions about the basis for what was happening. Kessler, however, had already committed himself to a narrative where calm behavior became suspicious simply because it did not help him. That is how weak cases get built. An officer starts with a conclusion, fails to find evidence, then lowers the standard until normal behavior can be described as concerning. Kessler went back to dispatch again. He requested additional confirmation on the vehicle and continued speaking in a way that made the stop sound unstable. He did not say he had the proof of theft because he could not say that honestly. He did the next closest thing. He spoke as if the possibility itself justified whatever he wanted to do next. That kind of wording is what usually gives bad arrests their first layer of cover, not facts. Just language that sounds official enough to survive until somebody reviews the actual record. Dr. Adrian Mercer understood that the stop was moving toward something worse. He asked whether he was being detained and what crime the officer believed had occurred. Those were exactly the right questions. They put pressure back on the officer to name a legal basis instead of hiding behind tone and repetition. Officer Kessler still did not give a clear answer. He moved closer to the car again, looked through the windows, circled around it, and acted like the car itself was evidence. Then he returned to Dr. Adrian Mercer and started focusing on behavior, not criminal behavior, just behavior he could label in vague terms later. He suggested Dr. Adrian Mercer was being too careful with his answers. He suggested he was being guarded. He suggested there was something off in the interaction. All of that would later collapse because the cameras showed exactly what the stop looked like. There was no visible panic, no hostility, no attempt to mislead. What Kessler called suspicious was really just a man refusing to panic in front of an officer who was fishing. At that point, Kessler had a choice. He could end the stop, issue whatever traffic warning or citation he wanted, and drive away. That option was still there. It would have been the lawful option. It would also have required him to accept that he had built the stop around a false assumption. He was not going to do that. Instead, he crossed the line. He told Dr. Adrian Mercer he was being detained on suspicion related to possible vehicle theft and fraudulent ownership documents. That was the first time he tried to turn his theory into a formal basis for action. The problem was obvious. He still had no concrete evidence for either claim. He had no stolen vehicle hit. He had no contradictory VIN return. He had no conflicting ownership record in front of him. He had no forged document identified by any actual check. He had a guess, and he had spent enough time repeating that guess to himself that he began treating it like probable cause. Dr. Adrian Mercer responded the same way he had handled the entire stop. He did not escalate. He did not resist. He asked what facts supported that detention when the records had already come back clean. Kessler did not answer in a way that could survive later review. He just kept asserting control and speaking as if authority itself made the detention lawful. Then he made the arrest. He put Dr. Adrian Mercer in handcuffs on the roadside and treated the moment as though it were the natural result of a careful investigation. It was not. It was the result of one officer refusing to let go of a biased assumption. The arrest was illegal the moment it happened because the factual basis was not there. The cameras would later make that simple. Dr. Adrian Mercer did not fight him. He did not shout. He did not give Kessler the scene he seemed to want. He stood there, let the cuffs go on, and kept asking the same clear question in different forms. What lawful basis do you have to arrest me when the vehicle is registered to me and there is no evidence it was stolen? That question hung over the whole scene. Kessler could not answer it directly because every real check had already undercut his theory. So he fell back on vague police language again. He referred to suspicious circumstances. He referred to concerns about authenticity. He referred to the need for further investigation. It sounded official in the moment. On paper and on camera, it would later look exactly like what it was: unsupported escalation. That was the mask-off moment. Up to then, he could still pretend he was being overly cautious. Once he made the arrest without evidence, that excuse started collapsing. He had taken the most serious step available to him without a lawful foundation. That is the kind of decision that destroys an officer when the record is clean enough. And the record was very clean. The body camera had captured a calm, compliant driver from the beginning. The dash footage had captured a routine stop with no visible sign of criminal conduct. The dispatch log had captured the way Kessler slowly built a story around suspicion instead of reporting concrete facts. Once all three were put together, the arrest would look exactly like profiling dressed up as police work. Kessler still did not understand how exposed he was. He was focused on control. He had handcuffed the driver. He had turned the stop into an arrest. In his head, that probably felt like confirmation that he had been right to push. Some officers mistake escalation for validation. They think that once they make the arrest itself gives the stop weight. It does not. If the basis is weak, the arrest only makes the misconduct easier to see. Dr. Adrian Mercer was placed by the patrol car, while Kessler continued trying to make the story sound stronger over the radio. He repeated concerns about ownership. He referred again to suspicious behavior. He talked as if the detention had revealed something meaningful. It had not. Nothing new had appeared. The arrest had not uncovered evidence. It had only locked in his bad judgment. Then the stop started turning against him in a way he had not expected. The name he had been treating as just another license entry began to register with other people. Dispatch looked harder. Someone higher up recognized it. The questions on the other end of the line changed. Kessler was no longer speaking into a vacuum where vague language would be accepted without thought. He still did not fully understand where that was headed. At that moment, he thought he had pushed a driver into custody and would write the rest up later. He thought the hard part was done. He did not yet realize that the arrest itself had created the biggest problem of his career, because the man he had just placed in handcuffs was not only a surgeon, he was one of the most prominent people in the city's medical system, and the first people realizing that were no longer standing on the roadside. They were listening, checking, and starting to understand just how badly the stop had gone. That was where the stop stopped being something Officer Daniel Kessler could manage by tone and confidence. Once Dr. Adrian Mercer's identity was checked more carefully, the issue changed immediately. Kessler had treated him like a driver he could keep under pressure while he searched for a reason to justify the stop. Now supervisors were looking at the same documents Kessler had already seen, and those documents were not supporting the arrest. Dr. Adrian Mercer was not only a surgeon, he owned the hospital network tied to a large part of the city's medical system. His name was widely known. That did not make the arrest wrong. The arrest was already wrong. What it did was make the department pay attention right away. A supervisor got involved, and the stop had to be explained in concrete terms. That was where Kessler's problem became obvious. The car was not reported stolen. The registration matched Dr. Adrian Mercer. The insurance was active. The driver's license matched the paperwork. There was no solid fact showing fraud, theft, or any other crime tied to the car. Kessler had still made the arrest. He tried to defend it the same way he had handled the stop. He used broad language. He said the driver's behavior raised concern. He said the ownership issue did not sit right with him. He said more verification was needed. None of that answered the real problem. He had already put handcuffs on a man without evidence that a crime had occurred. That became even clearer once the recordings were reviewed. The body camera showed Dr. Adrian Mercer staying calm, answering questions and following instructions. The dash camera showed an ordinary roadside stop with no sign of criminal conduct. The dispatch log showed Kessler shaping the stop around suspicion that he never backed up with facts. Once those pieces were compared, the arrest looked exactly as bad as it was. Dr. Adrian Mercer was eventually released, but the release did not solve anything for Kessler. The arrest had already happened. The stop had already been recorded. The department now had to deal with an officer who had escalated without lawful cause. Then Kessler made another mistake. He wrote the report as if the arrest had been supported by the encounter. He described Dr. Adrian Mercer in suspicious terms. He wrote as if there had been uncertainty about ownership for longer than there actually had been. He tried to present the arrest as a reasonable response to a developing situation. The report did not match the video. That mismatch turned a bad stop into a bigger case. It was no longer only about profiling and illegal arrest. It was also about whether Kessler had exaggerated or falsified parts of his justification after the fact. Internal Affairs opened an investigation. At that point, the department was dealing with a clean evidence problem. The footage was clear. The audio was clear. The paperwork was clear. Kessler's explanation was the weak part of the record, not the strong part. News of the stop started spreading through the hospital system first. Then city officials heard about it. Lawyers got involved after that. Local media followed quickly because the core facts were simple and hard to defend. A black surgeon had been arrested in his own car, even though the documents were valid and the car was not stolen. There was no good way to explain that. Kessler had treated the car itself like a reason to suspect crime. He had treated his own disbelief like grounds to keep pushing. That approach held up on the roadside, only because he had the badge and Dr. Adrian Mercer stayed calm. It did not hold up once the evidence was reviewed by other people. By then, the stop was no longer about what Kessler thought he saw that night. It was about what the department could clearly prove he had done. Once Internal Affairs had the full record, Officer Daniel Kessler's position became very weak very fast. This was not a complicated case. The department had the body camera, the dash footage, the dispatch audio, the registration records, and Kessler's report. Those pieces should have supported each other if the stop had been lawful. They did not. The video showed a calm and cooperative driver. The records showed valid ownership. The audio showed Kessler building suspicion before he had evidence. The report tried to justify an arrest that the rest of the record did not support. That is why the case collapsed. The department could not defend the arrest as a close judgment call. There was no probable cause for vehicle theft. There was no basis to treat the registration as fake. There was no behavior from Dr. Adrian Mercer that justified turning a traffic stop into handcuffs. Once that was clear, the department had to face the next issue. Kessler had not just made a bad decision. He had pushed past the legal limit of his authority and then tried to explain it in a way that did not match the footage. That is what ended his career there. Internal Affairs concluded that he had made an illegal arrest, acted without lawful cause, and exaggerated key parts of his justification. The department fired him. They could not keep him after that without accepting the risk that every future arrest, report, and courtroom appearance tied to his name would be attacked through this stop. Once an officer loses credibility that cleanly, the badge becomes hard to defend. Kessler had started that night thinking he could control the scene because he had authority, and Dr. Adrian Mercer was alone on the roadside. In the end, that same stop became the record that destroyed him. Not because anyone had to invent anything. Because the cameras were on, the documents were real, and his own decisions were bad enough to stand on their own. Dr. Adrian Mercer did not stop at the firing. He sued Kessler and the department for illegal arrest, racial profiling, and violation of his civil rights. That lawsuit was the next problem, and it was serious. The stop was already public by then. The facts were already easy to explain. A black man was pulled over in his own car, gave valid documents, stayed calm, and still ended up in handcuffs because an officer decided the car did not fit the driver. That is a case people understand immediately. The department now had to defend not just the stop, but the choices around it. Why the detention was extended. Why the radio traffic sounded the way it did. Why the arrest happened without real evidence. Why the report did not match the recordings. Those questions kept the incident alive because there was no simple answer that made the officer's conduct look reasonable. That was the real damage. Kessler lost his job, but the consequences went beyond him. The department came under pressure to explain training, supervision, and how an officer felt comfortable taking a stop that far with so little factual support. People started asking whether this was truly one officer acting alone, or whether he had simply done in public what had gone unchecked in smaller stops before. That is the kind of pressure departments hate because it moves the story from one man's misconduct to the culture around him. The hospital system did not let the matter fade either. Dr. Adrian Mercer was too visible, too established, and too careful in the way he handled the stop for the department to dismiss him as a difficult driver or a misunderstanding. He had done everything right. That made the case stronger. It removed the usual excuses. There was no aggressive behavior to point to, no refusal to comply, no confusion in ownership records, just a biased assumption, an illegal arrest, and a report that could not survive review. That is why the ending was satisfying. Officer Daniel Kessler thought he was dealing with someone he could intimidate and define on the spot. He thought he could turn disbelief into authority and authority into custody. Instead, he created a clean record of misconduct. It cost him his badge. It pulled him into court. It put his conduct under a microscope he could not control. And that is the real lesson here. This story was never about a car by itself. It was about what happens when an officer sees a person, decides they do not belong where they are, and then uses police power to force that belief into action. The reason Kessler lost in the end was simple. He had no facts. He had a bias, and he acted on it anyway. Once the footage was reviewed, the uniform could not protect him from what he had done. A lot of officers count on the moment being all that matters. They count on pressure, confusion, and the assumption that their version will carry more weight than the driver's. That works until the evidence is clear enough. Then the whole thing flips. The same stop they thought they controlled becomes the proof against them. That is exactly what happened here. Let me know what you would have done in Dr. Adrian Mercer's position. And if you have ever seen a stop like this turn into something it never should have become, put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
All right, both of you, IDs, right now.
What's the reason?
You're in an area with break-ins. I need to know who you are.
Just standing here is not suspicious. What specific facts made you stop us?
You two look like you're scouting, like you're casing places.
That's not a fact, that's a guess.
Start me a second unit, possible drug activity.
The Mesa officer thought he was stopping just another black couple he could pressure, confuse, and send on their way with no questions asked. He had no idea he was already talking himself into a record, into radio traffic he couldn't clean up later, and into a stop that another officer was about to examine line by line. What he tried to sell as a routine contact was already turning into the kind of encounter that exposes exactly how bad stops happen in the first place. Before this goes further, drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if you follow stories about accountability, bad stops, and people who know how to hold their ground without losing control, hit like and subscribe. This started in Mesa, Arizona, in a quiet commercial area that didn't give the officer much to work with. Parked cars, storefronts, low traffic, no crowd, no active disturbance. Edward Ellison and Tiana Ellison were standing there like countless other people stand near businesses every day, talking and minding their own business. Nothing dramatic. That's what made what happened next so telling. The officer rolled up and skipped right past normal contact. He didn't come in like someone checking on a situation. He came in like he'd already decided what they were. His first move was control, identification, questions framed like commands. Then the real tell came out fast. He started implying that they didn't fit the area, not directly at first. Officers who do this a lot usually don't say the ugliest part immediately. They circle it. They let the suspicion hang in the air and act like everyone is supposed to understand what they mean without them having to say it clean. Edward and Tiana caught it right away. They didn't match his energy. That mattered. A lot of people think the turning point in these encounters comes when voices rise. Sometimes it does. Here it came because the couple refused to help him build the stop for himself. They stayed calm and made him do the work. Edward asked what legal basis he had for stopping them. Tiana asked whether they were actually being detained. Very simple questions. The kind that sound almost too basic until an officer can't answer them. And he couldn't. Instead of naming a crime, he drifted into theory. He suggested they might be scouting homes or businesses. That was the first invented layer, not based on a report, not based on observed tools, forced entry, masks, lookout behavior, or anything real. Just a theory built around presence. Two black people standing in a place where, in his view, they needed to explain themselves. That was the engine under the whole thing. Tiana quietly started recording audio. That decision changed everything, even though the officer didn't know it yet. That's how a lot of these encounters work. The person trying to control the scene thinks the moment belongs to him because he has the badge, the radio, the uniform, the official posture. But the record starts moving in another direction, a phone in a hand, audio running, timestamps, tone, word choice. What was asked? What was dodged? What got added later? Once that exists, the story doesn't belong only to the officer anymore. Edward kept pressing the same point, not arguing all over the place, not taking the bait, just bringing it back. What crime was being investigated? Were they free to leave? What facts created suspicion? The officer still wouldn't answer straight. He pushed harder instead. That's another bad sign. When an officer has lawful grounds, he usually states them. When he doesn't, he often tries to replace legal clarity with pressure. Then he called for backup, and he made it worse. Over the radio, he added possible drug activity. Just dropped it into the encounter like he needed a heavier label to justify the direction this was going. No drug scene, no suspicious items, no exchange, no odor described, no paraphernalia, no actual criminal conduct. Nothing in the situation as described supported that leap. He just needed something uglier, something that would make the stop sound more defensible once other units started listening. That's the part officers sometimes forget. Radio traffic isn't just theater for the moment. It's evidence later. Once a false narrative enters the log, it can either be supported or it can collapse. There isn't much room in between. Edward and Tiana heard the shift. So did anyone who would have reviewed the dispatch trail later. The stop had now moved from vague suspicion to active narrative building. Same encounter, same empty facts, bigger accusation. The officer kept trying to make them play the role he'd assigned them. He wanted nervousness. He wanted overreaction. He wanted one bad sentence, one angry move, one excuse to say his instincts had been right all along. He didn't get it. Tiana stayed steady. Edward stayed direct. They didn't help him fix the holes in his own stop. That's what made the scene more dangerous for him, even if he didn't realize it yet. Because once a stop like this fails to produce facts, the officer has two choices: end it or double down. He doubled down. By then, the whole contact had become something bigger than one patrol officer talking too much in a parking area. It was turning into a test of who could actually carry the burden of truth once more the people got involved. The first officer was betting on the usual outcome. Backup arrives, uniforms align. The original version gets protected. The civilians get outnumbered and worn down. That bet was about to fail. The next officer coming in wasn't walking into a clean scene. He was walking into a stop built on shifting claims, unanswered legal questions, and a drug reference that didn't match any visible fact. And Edward and Tiana weren't standing there confused about what was happening. They were tracking every piece of it, calmly, precisely. The first officer still thought he had time to shape the story. He didn't, because the second officer, Daniel Reeves, was about to ask the exact kind of simple professional questions that bad stops never survive. Officer Daniel Reeves arrived expecting the usual thing: a patrol officer making contact, a couple of civilians, some explanation that would sound thin but usable. That's probably what the first officer expected too. He'd already laid the groundwork over the radio. Possible casing, possible drug activity. Enough loaded language to make the stop sound more serious than it was. But Reeves didn't just absorb the first version and move on. He started asking basic questions, the kind that should have been answered immediately if the stop had any real foundation. What exactly had been observed? What crime was being investigated? Who had reported it? What specific facts led to the drug reference? Had either of them been seen handling narcotics, exchanging items, hiding contraband, trying to flee, or doing anything that pointed to an actual offense? The first officer had no clean answer. He kept circling back to impressions, presence, vibes, the area, how they looked standing there, how long they'd been there. It was weak, worse than weak. It sounded like a man trying to reverse engineer reasonable suspicion after he'd already made the stop. And Reeves could see it. That changed the whole energy of the scene. Not loudly, not dramatically. This wasn't one officer openly dressing another one down in front of civilians. It was subtler than that, more damaging too. Reeves kept it professional. He asked short questions. He stuck to facts. He didn't rescue the first officer by adding his own assumptions. That alone started stripping the stop down to what it really was. Edward and Tiana noticed it right away. They could tell Reeves wasn't eager to rubber stamp what had already happened. He wasn't hostile toward them. He wasn't performing solidarity for the first officer. He was looking for something objective he could write down and defend later. He wasn't finding it. The first officer felt the shift, too. And this is where officers like that often get themselves in deeper trouble. Instead of backing out cleanly, he started trying to soften his earlier language without fully letting it go. He hinted that it was just a field interview, just a routine check, just making contact in an area where businesses and homes mattered, just trying to be proactive. That might have worked if he hadn't already gone further, but he had. He'd already implied they didn't belong there. He'd already floated the theory that they were scouting locations for crime. He'd already injected drugs into the radio traffic. Once an officer does that, he can't casually rewind the encounter and pretend it was community policing. Reeves kept asking, had there been a complainant? No clear answer. Had either person admitted to anything? No. Had the first officer seen contraband? No. Had they tried to leave after being told they were detained for a specific crime? That question hung there because the first officer still hadn't clearly established any lawful detention in the first place. That's the part that usually gets buried in stories like this. People talk about attitude, tone, respect, officer safety, all the vague language that lets bad stops breathe. But the real center of it is simple. What specific articulable facts existed? At the moment the officer decided these two people weren't just citizens standing in public, but potential criminals who needed to identify themselves and justify being there. Reeves was effectively forcing that question into the open, and there still wasn't a real answer. Edwards stayed locked in. He didn't start grandstanding just because another officer seemed more professional. He kept it narrow. Legal basis. Facts. Detained or not detained. He wasn't trying to win the street argument. He was making sure nobody could later pretend this had been some chaotic misunderstanding. Tiana did the same. Calm, focused. Recording, still running. Then the stop broke open. Edward and Tiana presented federal credentials. Not in some flashy way, not as a threat. They didn't suddenly become louder or smug. They just produced identification that changed what the first officer thought he was dealing with. Tiana's credentials tied her to civil rights work. And in that moment, the first officer understood something ugly all at once. This wasn't going to stay trapped inside his version of events. These weren't two people he could intimidate, delay, or confuse until they gave up and left. They knew exactly what mattered. Records mattered. Language mattered. Sequence mattered. Every claim he'd made was now a potential exhibit. His tone changed immediately. That's always revealing. Not because authority should only be respected when a person has status. That's the whole problem. He hadn't treated them like ordinary people entitled to ordinary rights. He'd treated them like convenient suspects until he saw credentials he associated with consequence. Then suddenly he sounded measured, more polite, more casual, more interested in wrapping things up without friction. Too late. Reeves had already seen enough. The recording already existed. The radio traffic already existed. And Edward and Tiana had just shown that they were not only calm under pressure, but fully prepared to follow the paper trail after the stop ended. The first officer started trying to repackage the contact. He suggested it was all routine. Standard. No big deal. Just checking. Just making sure everything was okay. But that version couldn't survive the timeline. Routine contacts don't usually start with demands unsupported by clear facts. They don't usually involve telling people they don't fit the area. They don't usually develop into unsupported theories about casing property. And they definitely don't suddenly add drug suspicion over the radio for no factual reason. The whole thing was now sitting in plain view. A bad stop. A changing story. A backup officer who wouldn't decorate it with fake certainty. That's when command had to enter the scene. Because once an encounter starts unraveling in front of multiple officers, somebody higher usually gets called to contain the damage. A sergeant arrived. By then, the first officer had lost the core battle. Not the ego battle, the factual one. The sergeant wasn't arriving to a blank slate. He was arriving to a stop where another officer had already been asking why the legal basis didn't make sense, where the couple remained composed, and where the original officer's own radio language was now part of the problem. Tiana didn't waste time. She formally stated that she had a full audio recording of the encounter. Then she laid out exactly what would happen next. Body camera footage would be requested. CAD records would be requested. Dispatch logs would be requested. There would be an internal complaint and a full investigation into the detention. That was the moment the stop fully flipped. Not because anyone raised their voice. Not because the first officer got publicly humiliated in some dramatic movie scene way. It flipped because the tools of accountability were now on the table in a specific, informed, unavoidable way. Recording, logs, video, supervisor awareness, a witness officer who had already made clear there was no solid basis for what happened. And Reeves didn't blur it to protect the stop. He confirmed in substance that there was no valid basis for detention. That's a brutal thing for a bad stop. Once that gets acknowledged on scene by another officer, the original version starts dying before the report is even written. The sergeant had very little room left. He couldn't credibly turn the couple into the problem. They were calm, consistent, precise. He couldn't sell the stop as some fast-moving uncertainty. There was no real offense driving it, just an officer who saw a black couple in a quiet area and started building suspicion around their existence. So the pressure changed direction. Not openly, but it changed. The question was no longer what Edward and Tiana were doing there. The question was what the first officer thought he was doing. The sergeant understood the problem fast. Not because the first officer explained it well. He didn't. The sergeant understood it because the stop had already been stripped down to its weak parts before he got there. No clear reported crime, no specific observed conduct, no real explanation for why drug activity had suddenly gone over the radio. And now a full audio recording sitting in Tiana's possession. That changes the scene fast. The first officer still tried to shrink what happened. He pushed the safer version now. He acted like it had been a basic contact that got misunderstood. He tried to flatten the escalation and make the whole thing sound administrative. That wasn't going to hold. Not with Reeves there. Not with the couple staying consistent. Not with the sequence already laid out in real time. Tiana made it plain that they weren't interested in arguing on the sidewalk. They were interested in records. She stated that they would be requesting the body camera footage, the CAD entries, the dispatch audio, the unit history, and the incident documentation tied to the stop. She also made clear that her audio recording captured the officer's shifting reasoning from the beginning. That's when the first officer really lost control of the encounter. He couldn't fix the timeline anymore. He couldn't smooth over what he said first by changing his tone at the end. Edward stayed the same way he'd been the whole time. Calm, focused, no speech, no performance. He kept it on one issue. There had been no lawful basis to turn them into suspects. That was the point. Everything else was cleanup. Reeves didn't retreat from what he'd already made clear. He confirmed in front of the sergeant that there was no valid basis for detention based on what had been personally observed. That mattered more than people realize. Internal cases often turn on whether someone inside the system is willing to say the obvious before the paperwork gets massaged. Reeves did. He didn't make a scene. He didn't need to. He just didn't help bury it. At that point, the sergeant did the only thing left to do. He ended the stop. Edward and Tiana were released. No citation, no warning, no contraband, no criminal referral, no supporting facts for the drug claim. Nothing. The entire encounter had started with suspicion and ended with emptiness. That's usually the clearest sign that the suspicion was never real in the first place. And that's where some people think the story ends. Couple gets released, bad stop over, everybody goes home. Not this time. Because the real damage for the first officer started after the scene was quiet again. Edward and Tiana followed through. They didn't let the encounter turn into one of those stories people tell privately and never document. They moved fast. Records requests went in. The audio was preserved. Notes were made while every detail was still fresh. Times, sequence, exact shifts in language. The point where the officer suggested they didn't fit the area. The point where he floated the casing theory. The point where drug activity suddenly appeared with no factual basis. The point where Reeves started asking the questions the first officer couldn't answer. The point where the tone changed after credentials came out. Every important move had a place on the timeline. That made it dangerous for the department to dismiss. Internal investigators had a simple problem in front of them. If the officer's version was legitimate, the evidence should support it. The body camera should show objective facts. The CAD notes should line up with the stated basis for the stop. The dispatch traffic should reflect actual observations. The secondary officer's account should reinforce the original decision. That's what would have saved him. It didn't. The review started focusing on the gap between what he claimed and what he actually had. Investigators looked at the stop itself, then started widening the lens. Prior contacts, radio traffic patterns, similar incidents. Other times he escalated vague encounters into criminal suspicion without clear legal grounds. That kind of review is where trouble gets real, because one bad stop can be explained away by people who want to protect the badge. A pattern is harder to hide. And the patterns started to matter. Supervisors had to ask why this officer kept turning thin observations into heavier accusations. Why ordinary presence kept becoming detention pressure. Why unsupported criminal theories kept showing up in his field contacts. Why the language in his stops seemed to grow more serious whenever he needed cover for an encounter that began with almost nothing. He got pulled from street duty while the investigation moved forward. That wasn't the final consequence, but it was the first public sign that the department understood this couldn't just be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. Street duty is trust. Once that trust gets questioned inside the department, everything tightens around the officer. Reports get read differently. Old contacts get revisited. Supervisors stop assuming judgment and start checking it. The case also spread beyond internal channels. What happened to Edward and Tiana got discussed the way these incidents usually do when they hit a nerve. First among people who already knew how these stops happen. Then among people who had their own stories. Same structure, same tactics. Officer sees someone and decides they don't belong, pressures them for identification, invents a theory, then goes fishing for something bigger when challenged. People recognize the pattern because they'd lived versions of it. The only difference here was that this one had cleaner evidence than most. That's why the recording mattered so much. Without it, the first officer could have leaned on the usual defense. He could have said the couple seemed evasive. He could have said there were indicators that didn't fully translate into a report. He could have claimed his radio language got misunderstood in a fluid situation. He could have hidden behind officer safety and proactive policing and all the other catchphrases that make bad stops harder to challenge. The recording boxed him in. Reeves boxed him in too. That combination was brutal. One record from outside the department, one witness from inside it. Same basic conclusion. The suspicion didn't come from facts. The facts were being invented to support the suspicion. That's the heart of the story. The officer didn't lose because Edward and Tiana had status. He didn't lose because they produced federal credentials. He'd already lost before that, really. He lost because he tried to build a criminal narrative around a black couple doing nothing wrong. And that narrative got preserved before he could rewrite it. The credentials just made him realize too late that the people in front of him knew exactly how to force the system to answer for it. And that part matters. A lot. Because rights aren't supposed to depend on whether the person stopped knows civil rights procedure, knows records law, knows how dispatch logs work, or has a second officer willing to tell the truth. Ordinary people deserve lawful treatment too. The story hits hard because it shows how often accountability still depends on preparation, documentation, and somebody refusing to play along with a false frame. Edward and Tiana didn't win by outshouting him. They didn't win by getting emotional and trying to beat a badge with volume. They won by staying locked on facts, by not letting the officer turn the encounter into a personality contest, by recording, by asking the same legal questions he didn't want to answer, by understanding that oversight starts the second someone decides to preserve the truth instead of trusting the system to do it for them. That's why the stop fell apart. Not because the officer had a sudden change of heart. He changed tone only when he saw possible consequences. That's an important detail, and people shouldn't look away from it. He treated them one way when he thought they were easy targets. He treated them another way when he thought they had institutional power behind them. That switch told the whole story on its own. In the end, the officer tried to turn an ordinary moment into criminal suspicion. He tried to make presence sound like planning. He tried to make a weak stop sound serious by adding drugs to the radio. He tried to lean on the usual assumption that once police language enters the record first, it controls the story. He was wrong. The record beat him. The questions beat him. The facts beat him. And that's the lesson here. When somebody in authority starts building a case out of nothing, the smartest response isn't panic, it's precision. Know what was said. Know what was observed. Know what changed. Know what can be requested later. Once the false narrative gets checked against the actual sequence, a lot of power disappears fast. So that's the story. A Mesa patrol officer thought he had found just another couple he could pressure without consequence. What he actually found was a clean record, a professional witness, and two people who understood that accountability starts before the stop is even over. What would you have done in that situation? Have you ever seen an officer try to create suspicion first and look for facts later? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
I need to come in and take a quick look around. Step back.
Do you have a warrant?
I'm conducting an investigation. I have reasonable
Investigation.
suspicion.
Reasonable suspicion is not a key to my house. Do you have a warrant, consent, or an emergency?
Innocent people cooperate. You refusing makes you look suspicious.
Refusal is not suspicion. It's a right. Are you asking for consent or giving a lawful order? State the legal
I'm not
basis.
playing word games.
Police overreach keeps happening because some officers think pressure can replace the law. That's what Officer Brett Tanner tried at a private home one evening. He showed up, demanded entry, and acted like the resident had no real choice. He was wrong. The man at the door knew the law, stayed calm, and forced Tanner into a mistake that would later blow up his career. Tanner still had no idea the resident was Privacy Commissioner Elias Rowan. Comment where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about civil rights, police abuse, and real accountability, like the video and subscribe. Tanner was sent to the house on a suspicious activity call. The report was weak. No violence, no emergency, no crime clearly in progress. Elias Rowan opened the door. Tanner immediately said he needed to come inside and look around. Rowan asked if he had a warrant. Tanner said he was conducting an investigation. That was the first red flag. He didn't answer the question because the answer was no. He had no warrant. He just expected the badge and tone to carry him through the door. Rowan asked again, did Tanner have a signed warrant authorizing entry into the house? Tanner changed the wording and said he had reasonable suspicion. That was false. Reasonable suspicion does not allow an officer to enter a private residence. It doesn't replace a warrant. Tanner was either bluffing or didn't know the limit of his own authority. Rowan didn't reveal who he was. He let Tanner keep talking. He asked whether there was an emergency inside the home. Tanner gave no clear answer. Rowan asked whether anyone inside was in immediate danger. No answer. He asked whether Tanner had seen a crime from outside the property. Again, nothing solid. That exposed the whole move. Tanner wanted entry first and justification later. Then came the usual pressure. He said innocent people cooperate. He implied refusal made Rowan look suspicious. He said he only needed a quick look. Rowan answered with the law. He said entry into a private residence requires a warrant, consent, or an actual emergency. None of those existed. Tanner kept pushing. He brought up officer safety and said he needed to secure the scene. Same tactic, different wording. Rowan asked a direct question. Was Tanner giving a lawful order based on specific legal authority? Or was he asking for consent to enter? Tanner couldn't answer it cleanly. If it was consent, Rowan could refuse. If it was a lawful order, Tanner had to name the legal basis. He didn't either. He just repeated that he needed to get inside and said Rowan was making things harder. That's what officers do when they don't have legal footing. They try to make the person asserting rights sound like the problem. The scene itself made Tanner look worse. Quiet residential street, no signs of distress, no emergency, no reason for forced entry. The front of the house was covered by security cameras, and Tanner's body camera was running. A neighbor had started watching. A delivery driver slowed down near the curb. Tanner still kept pressing. Rowan asked for his badge number. Tanner gave it. Then Rowan asked him to state on camera what legal standard allowed entry into a private home without a warrant. Tanner said reasonable suspicion again. That was a serious mistake. Now the false claim was on video. Rowan said there would be no consent to enter and no consent to search. Tanner reacted by putting his hand on the door and pushing it wider. Then he moved a foot toward the threshold, as if he were about to step in. That changed the case. This was no longer just verbal pressure. It was an attempted unlawful entry. Rowan stopped him immediately. He told Tanner to remove his hand from the door and keep his foot outside. He stated clearly that no consent had been given and that any attempt to enter would be unlawful. Tanner hesitated. He tried to go back to the vague complaint. Suspicious activity, need to verify, neighborhood concern. None of it answered the basic question. Rowan asked him one last time what emergency justified entry into the house. Tanner had no answer. That was when the power shifted. Tanner still had the uniform, but the bluff was finished. He had made false legal claims on camera and tried to push into a private home without a warrant. Rowan let him finish talking. Then he decided Tanner needed to know exactly whose door he was standing at. Rowan told Tanner he was going to make this very simple for him. He said the officer was standing at the home of Elias Rowan, the current privacy commissioner, and that every second of this contact was being recorded for formal review. He also said Tanner had just tried to enter a private residence without a warrant, without consent, and without any emergency that could justify it. That landed immediately. Tanner's whole posture changed, not because he suddenly respected the law, because he understood the risk. A minute earlier, he was still trying to dominate the scene. Now he was trying to figure out how much damage he had already done. He asked Rowan to repeat his name. Rowan did. Then he identified his office in full. That was the break in the scene. Tanner stopped talking over him. He stopped pushing the doorway. He pulled his hand back. He stepped off the threshold. Too late to undo anything, but early enough to show he finally understood this wasn't an ordinary resident. Rowan didn't let him regain control of the exchange. He laid it out in order. Tanner had demanded entry without a warrant. He had used reasonable suspicion as if it authorized a residential search. It did not. He had tried to pressure consent by implying refusal created suspicion. He had then placed a hand on the door and moved into the entry line without lawful authority. Every part of that sequence was now preserved on camera. Tanner tried to shrink the incident. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said he was only trying to verify a complaint. He said he had not entered the home. That was weak, and Rowan treated it that way. He said attempted unlawful entry did not become lawful because the resident stopped it in time. He said coercion did not become consent because the officer failed to complete the search. He said the issue was not whether Tanner had managed to get fully inside. The issue was that he had no lawful basis to try. That's the part bad officers hate. Precision, no yelling, no chaos. Just a clean record, and a person who knows exactly how to describe the misconduct. Tanner then tried the fallback move. He asked if they could reset the conversation and handle the matter informally. Rowan refused that immediately. He said the matter had already moved past informal handling the moment Tanner asserted false authority and attempted to cross the threshold. Then he asked whether Tanner intended to call a supervisor himself or whether Rowan should request one through dispatch while the recording continued. Tanner paused again. He knew what either option meant. A supervisor arriving on scene would hear the legal issue while the body camera was still running. Dispatch records would pin the timeline down even further. There was no clean exit left. He called for a supervisor. That was the first correct decision he made at the house. While they waited, Rowan kept him pinned to facts. He asked whether dispatch had sent him on a report of violence. No. He asked whether dispatch had reported any imminent threat inside the home. No. He asked whether Tanner had observed anything from outside the property that could support immediate entry. No clear answer. Rowan asked him one more time to state whether he had relied on reasonable suspicion as grounds to enter the home. Tanner didn't want to repeat it now. He said he had been assessing the situation. That answer only made him look worse. A few minutes later, Sergeant Nina Holloway arrived. She stepped out of her car expecting a routine friction call between an officer and a resident. She walked into something much more serious. Tanner started trying to explain first. That was another mistake. Officers who know they're in trouble usually rush to frame the story before anyone else speaks. Holloway listened for a few seconds. Rowan cut in and identified himself. That changed her face immediately. She didn't become deferential. She became careful. Big difference. She understood at once that this was now a legal exposure issue for the department, not just a field supervision issue. She asked Rowan to explain what had happened from the beginning. He gave her the short version. Tanner demanded entry without a warrant. He claimed reasonable suspicion authorized it. He used pressure to force consent. He put his hand on the door and moved towards the threshold. The property cameras captured it. Tanner's body camera captured it. A neighbor and a driver had also witnessed part of the exchange. Holloway turned to Tanner and asked one direct question. Did he tell the resident that reasonable suspicion allowed him to enter the home? Tanner tried to soften it. He said he may have referred to investigative authority in the course of the contact. That answer did not help him. Holloway asked again, more directly this time. Did he or did he not say, reasonable suspicion justified entry? Tanner admitted he had said it. That was the point where the scene stopped being about judgment and became about evidence. Rowan then explained the problem in terms Holloway could not ignore. A home gets the highest level of protection. Entry requires a warrant, consent, or a recognized emergency exception. None existed here. Tanner had no warrant. He had no victim inside, no sounds of distress, no active pursuit, no visible crime, and no lawful basis to force access. He had relied on a false legal standard, then tried to convert pressure into compliance. That was not confusion. That was overreach. Holloway knew he was right. She also knew this had likely just become an internal affairs case before the officer even left the property. Tanner made one more bad move. He tried to suggest Rowan's refusal to cooperate had escalated the contact. Rowan shut that down fast. He said a citizen's refusal to waive constitutional protection is not escalation. It is the exercise of a right. The officer's decision to ignore that right was the escalation. That answer ended the argument right there. Holloway told Tanner to stop speaking. Then she apologized to Rowan, but Rowan didn't let the conversation drift into polite damage control. He said he was not interested in a porch apology. He wanted the names of every officer assigned to the call, confirmation that body camera footage would be preserved, confirmation that dispatch audio would be retained, and confirmation that the matter would be referred for formal review before the end of shift. That's how someone with actual institutional knowledge handles misconduct. No speeches, no emotional back and forth. Lock the record, preserve the evidence, Remove room for editing later. Holloway agreed. She gave her name and badge number. She said the footage would be flagged and preserved. She also said the call log and dispatch notes would be attached to the report. Rowan then made it worse for Tanner because he was still not done. He informed Holloway that Tanner's conduct raised not only constitutional issues, but also privacy governance concerns. An officer who casually claims authority to enter a private residence without legal basis is not just making a bad arrest decision. He is showing disregard for the boundary the law protects most. That becomes a training issue, a supervision issue, and a public trust issue all at once. That was the moment Tanner understood this was not heading toward a warning memo or a quiet correction. This would move. Fast. He tried one last time to speak directly to Rowan. He said he had no intention of violating anyone's rights. Rowan answered that intention was not the standard. Conduct was. That line finished him. Holloway directed Tanner back toward the sidewalk and away from the door. She then asked Rowan whether he intended to file a formal complaint. He said yes, and he said it would include unlawful attempted entry, coercive consent tactics, false statements of legal authority, and failure to articulate any emergency basis for bypassing the warrant requirement. Holloway didn't argue. She couldn't. Before ending the contact, Rowan gave one final statement for the record. He said rights do not depend on whether an officer feels inconvenienced by them. That was the entire case in one sentence. Tanner had shown up expecting an easy display of authority. He left the porch under supervision on camera after being corrected on the law at the home of the privacy commissioner himself. And the real damage was only starting. Rowan filed the complaint that same night. He didn't leave room for interpretation. He listed the sequence in order, attached the timestamps from the exterior security system, identified the attempted threshold entry, and described the exact legal claim Tanner had made on camera. He also requested preservation of all related material: body camera footage, dispatch audio, patrol car video, call notes, and supervisor communications. That mattered. Fast complaints with specific evidence are hard to bury. By the next morning, the case had already moved beyond a normal citizen complaint. Tanner had not just handled a call badly. He had asserted authority he did not have, used the wrong legal standard to demand access to a home, and done it in front of a resident whose job was built around privacy law and institutional compliance. Internal Affairs opened a review almost immediately. The first problem for Tanner was the video. His body camera matched Rowan's exterior footage. The sequence was clean. Tanner demanded entry. Rowan asked for a warrant. Tanner avoided the answer. Tanner relied on reasonable suspicion. Rowan asked whether there was an emergency. Tanner could not name one. Then came the pressure tactics. Refusal means suspicion. Quick look. Don't make this harder. Then the door. Hand on it. Push. Foot toward the threshold. There was no mystery in the footage. That's what made it bad. The second problem was dispatch. The original call did not support what Tanner tried to do at the house. It was a weak suspicious activity report with no violence, no emergency, and no instruction suggesting immediate danger inside the property. That destroyed any later attempt to claim he had responded to a crisis. Then, the witness statements came in. The neighbor across the street said she heard Tanner raising his voice and talking like he had the right to go inside. The delivery driver confirmed he saw the officer pressing the interaction and standing too close to the doorway. Neither witness could describe every legal detail, but they didn't need to. They supported the central point. Tanner was the one escalating the scene. Sergeant Nina Holloway's report didn't save him either. She documented that when she arrived, Rowan identified the false legal standard immediately, described the attempted entry clearly, and requested preservation of evidence on the spot. She also documented that Tanner admitted he had referred to reasonable suspicion as grounds for entry. Once that went into a supervisory report, his options got even smaller. Then Internal Affairs checked Tanner's history. That's where the case got worse. There had been prior complaints, not identical, but close enough to show a pattern. 2 earlier contacts had involved allegations that Tanner pressured residents during consent searches. One complaint said he implied refusal would create legal trouble. Another said he treated basic questions about warrants as non-cooperation. Those cases had not ended his career, but they now looked very different when placed next to the Rowan footage. That's how career-ending files get built, not from one bad clip alone. From one bad clip that suddenly makes the old complaints make sense. The department's legal office got involved before the first week was over. They understood the exposure. If Rowan wanted to litigate, the city was in a weak position. The facts were terrible. The recording was clear. The officer had used the wrong legal theory on camera. And the target of the misconduct was a national privacy official with the knowledge and credibility to explain every violation in public if necessary. That changed the department's tone fast. Tanner was pulled from patrol pending investigation. His access to independent fieldwork was suspended. He was ordered to submit a supplemental report explaining the legal basis for his attempted entry. That report hurt him even more. He tried to clean up the language. He stopped saying reasonable suspicion authorized entry and started using vague phrases about evolving safety assessment and investigative necessity. That might have worked in a case without footage. Here, it only made him look dishonest. Internal reviewers could compare the report to the video and see the gap immediately. That's a bad place for any officer. The original conduct is one problem. A paper trail that looks cleaned up after the fact is another. Rowan did not let the matter drift into internal silence. He kept it formal and public-facing at the same time. He notified the relevant oversight office, submitted a separate privacy governance memorandum on the misuse of legal authority during home contacts, and requested a policy review on consent search training. He was not just building a complaint against Tanner, he was building a record against the system that trained him. That widened the damage. Local reporters got hold of the story within days, not the full footage at first. Just the outline. Patrol officer demands entry into private home without warrant. Resident turns out to be privacy commissioner. Department opens internal investigation. That was enough. Once the existence of video became known, the story spread quickly. And it spread for a simple reason. People recognized the pattern. A lot of residents had their own version of the story. An officer talks like he already has the right. A citizen gets pressured into cooperating. The line between request and command gets blurred on purpose. Most cases never become national examples because the resident doesn't have cameras, legal knowledge, or a title that forces institutions to pay attention. This one had all three. That's why the public response hit hard. Civil liberties groups called it a textbook unlawful entry attempt. Former prosecutors said Tanner's legal reasoning made no sense. Retired judges speaking generally about search law pointed out the same thing Rowan had said at the door. A home is not searchable because an officer feels suspicious. The threshold matters. The warrant requirement matters. Consent has to be real. Pressure does not make it real. Inside the department, the case was turning toxic. Command staff now had two problems: the footage itself, and the fact that Tanner might not be an isolated problem. If one patrol officer was this comfortable inventing authority at someone's front door, supervisors had to answer the next question. How often had that tactic worked on people who did not know better? That question scared them more than Tanner did. By the second week, investigators had enough to move from review to recommendation. The findings were shaping up around 4 points: false statement of legal authority, attempted unlawful residential entry, coercive consent tactics, and inaccurate post-incident reporting. Any one of those could lead to major discipline. Together, they put termination on the table. Tanner started looking for a way out. He reportedly told colleagues the situation had been blown out of proportion because of who Rowan was. That argument went nowhere. Rowan's title had not created the misconduct. It had only prevented it from being buried. That's an important difference. If Tanner had done the same thing to a teacher, a mechanic, a nurse, or an elderly homeowner with no camera system, he might have walked away from it. That was the real scandal underneath the scandal, and everyone could see it now. By the end of the second week, the department had the footage, the reports, the witness statements, the dispatch logs, and the prior complaints lined up in one file. At that point, Tanner's problem was no longer the front porch. It was the fact that the whole record told the same story. The investigation ended Tanner's career. Internal Affairs found that he had no legal basis to enter the home, used false legal authority, tried to pressure consent, and then changed his wording in the report after the fact. The video made all of it easy to prove. He demanded entry, claimed reasonable suspicion allowed it, failed to identify any emergency, and then put his hand on the door and moved toward the threshold. The department fired him. Then the State Certification Board opened its own review. That mattered almost as much as the firing. Losing one job is one thing. Losing certification means other departments see the same record and the same risk. That's how a career really ends. Rowan kept the case focused on law and procedure. He made it clear this was not about personal status. It was about an officer trying to replace legal authority with pressure at the door of a private home. The fallout didn't stop with Tanner. The department had to review training, rewrite parts of its consent search guidance, and tighten rules for home entry contacts. Officers were retrained on the basic standards they should already have known. A home requires a warrant, valid consent, or an actual emergency. Suspicion alone is not enough. That was the real impact of the case. Tanner lost his job, but the bigger issue was exposed too. If Rowan had not known the law and had not had cameras, Tanner might have gotten away with it. That's the lesson. A badge does not erase civil rights. A demand is not the same as lawful authority. And the people